Hello again and welcome to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. As always, so grateful that you're joining us. Thank you for listening, whether it's through the radio airwaves or through the podcast. What's Working is available on both. It's the show designed to bring to you, to reveal, to uncover workplace, workforce, and marketplace trends. My goal is that you hear this show and are able to take one or maybe two ideas, apply them to your own life some way, whether it be your team, your workforce, your home life, your family, your kids, and get a little bit better at whatever it is that you do. Again, welcome to What's Working, and thank you so much for joining along. I've been thinking quite a bit about last week's show. You may recall the interview that I had with Ted Reese. Ted Reese's company is Cadence Environmental Energy. They're in the hazardous waste disposal, and the technicalities of what they do were fascinating to me. I've known Ted for years, and I had no idea of the detail of what it is that they do. So learning that, having that revealed to me by an old friend was really cool, I guess, interesting, etc. But what stood out to me as much was the leaps the company made forward after the change in leadership. Now, Ted's father had owned the company, does still own the company, majority shareholder, for years. And it was when he turned the leadership over to his son, the next generation, they saw huge strides forward in the company's profitability. Not to suggest that Mr. Reese, Ted's father, lacked that ability, but Ted was a better, and you can't argue with the numbers, Mr. Reese, if you're listening, but Ted was the better manager and the leader. Perhaps not as innovative and creative as the first generation, but the one that was able to squeeze the lemon a little bit differently and gets a different type of juice out of it. After we turned off the microphone, it became clear, as Ted shared with me, how the profitability of the organization began to really rise due to what Ted thinks and what I heard, his relationship and his treatment of the staff and the team. And that has been on my mind because last Tuesday night, I had a similar conversation with a colleague here locally who didn't exactly say it, but hinted that the CEO of his organization, who's been in that role for 25 years now, was beginning to get in the way. This man had created the organization, and the guy that I was talking to had begun when there were less than 15 people in the organization. They're now over 2,400 people, and the CEO is still leading the company like it is a startup. And I think his drive and his innovation, his demand for innovation, the CEO's drive and demand for innovation is laudable. But the guy that I was talking to hinted, he didn't exactly say it, but hinted that attitude is getting in the way of the performance of the organization. It's now time to manage a mature organization versus think of it as a growing entrepreneurial company. It has been, it is no longer. And the skill set required to lead a mature company is different. And the guy that I talked to, sat next to at dinner, is somewhat struggling in transmitting that message to the man who started the company. It's an age-old tale. The entrepreneurs tend to be poor at running the companies once they mature, but they don't know it, they're not aware of it, and they don't know when to get out. All right, there's more on that. We'll continue to come back to that subject. It's fascinating to me. I look for these stories. What you can expect after the first break. We're going back to a previous guest, and she has blossomed. She was killing it in the previous conversation, but has truly blossomed. Her name is Amy Morin. I'll tell you more about her after the break. She has racked up millions of views on her TED Talk. She sold a number of different books. She's now got, I'm counting here, 6 different books under her name, and her name is Amy Morin. Again, her first one was 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. We're going to ask Amy to apply this don't do attitude, what strong people don't do, to the workplace, to the workforce, and to the marketplace trends. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Thanks again. We'll be right back. Expect a great conversation with Amy Morin.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Thank you again for joining in on this show. I'm happy to have back on the show Amy Morin. It was 2021 that she was last on the show. She and I had met that spring at an event, and I was captured by her content. I told you in the introduction I'd share some numbers with you. She wrote an article that went viral and got 50 million views. She has done a TED Talk, which has received 22 million views. She's on to something in our society. Her book titles are 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do, and mentally strong parents, mentally strong women don't do, mentally strong couples don't do, etc., with one notable exception that we'll talk about. Amy, thank you so much for your time. Welcome back to What's Working.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back, Cam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it was a great conversation the last time. Your presentation, like I said, really captured me and my wife too. And we were in Oxford, Mississippi over the weekend, and there on Square Books, which is a famous bookstore in that part of the world, was your book. And I thought it's time for her to be back on the show. So you've got a new one, 13 Things Mentally Strong Couples Don't Do. In fact, I guess that was the one that I was looking at Square Books. Tell us a little bit about what got you to where you are in this position of offering such powerful advice to your customers?
Well, I was a therapist by trade and then went through a series of losses in my own life. My mother passed away just about a year after I became a therapist, and I had lost her very suddenly and unexpectedly. She had a brain aneurysm. And 3 years to the day that I lost my mom, my 26-year-old husband passed away from a heart attack. And so needless to say, my 20s were awful. And it was at a time when I'm building my career as a therapist, where I'm supposed to help other people deal with their problems. But my entire life was upside down and filled with grief and darkness. And it was really my own journey that made me want to know more about mental strength on a completely different level. It was no longer about what I'd learned in the college textbooks, but I really wanted to know what works and what doesn't. And then on one of the lowest days of my life is when I wrote that article that you referenced earlier that got the 50 million views. But I had really written it just as a letter to myself about what mentally strong people don't do. And I published it online sort of just on a whim. And I thought it would get a handful of views. Never imagined 50 million people would read it. And one of those people happened to be a literary agent who suggested I write a book. But as a therapist, I didn't even know how to write a book. I didn't know what a literary agent was. And I really had no plans to tell my story, but decided to do so and have been floored by the reception that my story and my message on mental strength has gotten over the last decade now.
Do you feel that the popularity of this subject matter is a reflection on our society in some way or another today? Or would this book, had the technology been available, this book have been popular in the 1980s, 1990s, or even would it have been popular back in the year, 1500, or even in the Roman times? Is the subject matter an evergreen topic, or is there something reflective of our time today that has made it so popular?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there is something evergreen to it. Like we know Stoics back in the much earlier times certainly talked about a lot of these things, about the philosophy of life isn't what happens to you, it's how you respond to it. And that can certainly be a part of mental strength. I think it depends on the time frame of when it had been released, sort of how it would have been interpreted. There's 10 years ago when I wrote this, there was a much bigger stigma against mental health. And so I think when the article came out, people were interested in talking about mental strength as opposed to just mental health. However, I think in that time, there was this belief that mental strength was about acting tough, kind of like the Navy SEAL persona of pretending like pain isn't a problem for you and just pushing through anything no matter what. That idea has changed over time. And if anything good came out of COVID, I think that was it, that we realized very quickly that it only takes a few things in our lives, a few changes to our environment to really put any of us in a serious mental health situation. And that mental health and mental strength aren't the same. You can have a mental health issue like depression and you can continue to build mental strength. And it's all about the choices that you make. So I feel like it's evolved over time in terms of how people have interpreted this. I think the moment that I put the article out there, there was that need for people to say, men who were saying, I don't want to talk about mental health, but I'll talk about mental strength. Yeah. And a lot of people, women especially as well, who said, how do we raise mentally strong kids? How do we be mentally strong at work? What does it look like to be a strong woman? Because we have so many examples of elite athletes and Navy SEALs that are typically men. So I think it hit at the right time. I think the definition of what it looks like to be mentally strong has evolved as people have seen things change in the world over the last decade. And I do hope it'll continue to be relevant moving forward as well.
I want to get from you a definition. So many questions already. What is your definition of mental strength?
So it has to do with the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you behave. So it's about knowing that everything you think isn't true. Your brain lies to you. And as you build mental strength, you can kind of figure that out. Your brain will doubt you sometimes. It will challenge you to give up when you don't need to, those sorts of things. The emotional component is knowing I don't have to be happy all the time and I'm okay with that. But also when I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, I don't have to stay stuck there. I do have some ability to change my emotional state when I need to. And then the behavioral piece is knowing what kind of action do I want to take? And sometimes that's contrary to how I feel. Maybe I don't feel like going to the gym, but I push myself to do it. Or I take care of myself in terms of how I sleep and how I eat. And just knowing that there's some kind of positive action you can always take, no matter how bad things are. So when you combine those three components, you have mental strength.
Is it not amazing to you, and perhaps this is a different conversation that would be best over a glass of wine or something like that there is this creature living inside of our head that is us, that is a narrator of our life, that is telling us lies every day, that somehow I feed this creature unwittingly, and it wakes up and whispers things to me that aren't true. And I can control it, but it's hard, that there's almost this persona in my head that is trying to upend every day. Isn't that not freaky in some way?
It really is. And then it gets a little bit freaky when you start to think, I can't trust my own brain. How do I make decisions when my brain is lying to me, when it's underestimating me, when it's overestimating how bad the consequences are going to be? How do you make a healthy decision when you're arguing with your own brain? And it's part science, part art, but to know that you don't have to believe everything you think. You can respond to those thoughts by saying, well, what's the truth here? You can dig a little deeper. You can ask for advice from other people. Like, this is what I'm thinking. What are you seeing?
Yeah.
And lots of different things you can do to figure out where's the truth.
You're right in regards to what you said a moment ago, in that mental health is now a common part of the conversation in the workplace. You'll recall that this show is workplace focused. And I remember prior to COVID, it seems like COVID accelerated that conversation, that it was not often talked about. It was on the list of things that I felt like people wanted to talk about, but were somewhat afraid or vulnerable to bring up. But I want to bring you to a conversation that I had about 6 weeks ago with a client in a hospital system. And her comment was that our staff today are, and this is her term, weaponizing mental health. They're weaponizing it against the leadership of the hospital. And they are saying, if you make me do this, it will, and whatever it could be come in on Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, somewhat standard requests of the workplace. If you make me do this, it will jeopardize my mental health. If you make me do this, it will make my mental health deteriorate, or et cetera. So the tail is kind of wagging the dog in this one situation of this lady that I talked to. She was the leader again of a large hospital, and she said, what do? We can't tell people to that we're going to make you do something that's going to jeopardize your mental health. So the question becomes, has the pendulum not swung too far in some instances? And I'm wondering what you've seen.
I think that this pendulum swinging idea, it often happens that way, right? And I think it has swung a little far in the other direction sometimes when people start doing just that, saying, well, I can't do that because it would make me depressed. Well, it's our responsibility to manage our mental health. And yes, the workplace has some responsibility in trying to give us a healthy environment, but we do have to accept responsibility too, that doing a job you don't love doesn't necessarily lead directly to anxiety or depression or mental illness. Just like, you could argue that when it comes to physical health too. And I think when we look at the difference between mental health and physical health, it starts to make more sense to us.
Amy Morin is an author. Her book titles include 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do, Mentally Strong Women Don't Do, Mentally Strong Couples Don't Do. We'll be back at it right after this break. You're listening to What's Working.
This is Bill Eastet. I perfected my baking recipe behind my live music stage at my little restaurant in Fairhope, Alabama. We have custom-made smokers and small batch bacon made just for you. So if you're looking for the best bacon in America that has been cured, smoked, and even serenaded by songwriters, you definitely need to try Billy's Small Batch Bacon. www.billysbacon.com.
Amy Morin is on the other side of a Zoom call from me. She is in, I think, her boat in Marathon Key, Florida, where she operates her business. She's a presenter. She's an author. I think, Amy, one of the last times we spoke, you had become an editor of a magazine as well, if my memory serves. We'll talk about that as we go along. Her content is read by 2 million readers each month on mental strength. Her numbers are remarkable, the number of followers that she had. Amy, prior to the break, imagine... We were just talking about this prior to the break. Imagine someone comes to you and says, if you make me do that, it's going to give me a depression and I'm going to have a hard time fighting out of the depression. What does the executive, the leader, say to someone who tries to weaponize mental health? How do you respond?
I think it's important to make sure that we're offering resources to people. Okay, if you think that this task is going to create depression for you, what can you do about that? You could see a therapist. Maybe the company has an employee assistance program. Maybe the company says we have a wellness coordinator. We have something. Here's what you could do. Here's how you could talk about that and figure out how to do this thing, perhaps without hurting yourself. And if we treated it like a physical strength issue or physical health issue, if you said to somebody, we're going to need those boxes carried across the room, and the person says, if I do that, I'm going to end up in the hospital for 6 months because I'm going to injure my back. What would we then, how would we treat that? We would either say, let's figure out a way for you to safely do that. We'll perhaps make an accommodation. We'll teach you how to do it differently. Or maybe you need to find a different position, but how could we support you in this so you don't hurt yourself? And the thing is that when it comes to mental health, it's often a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I say, hey, if I can't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to get a horrible mental illness, like we could talk ourselves into feeling awful. And so we don't want people to do that. We want to empower people to say, all right, even when you have to do something you don't want to do, how can you stay mentally healthy? And I would definitely refer people to whatever resources the company has to assist with that.
I noticed that no part of your answer includes the executive saying, well, then we'll find something else for you to do. I noticed that no part of your answer is the executive or whomever is asking the person to do this task is backing down. They're saying, this is what you are hired to do. Therefore, we're going to expect you to do it.
Right. And, because I think if we get into let's make the special accommodations and not make people do things they don't want to do, that gets into some pretty tricky territory. And in fact,
a slippery slope.
Right. I mean, a lot of people, and when people are struggling with mental health, again, it goes back to their brain lying to them. As a therapist, I have countless people who come into my office and say, my depression makes me want to stay in bed. And I think if I just stay home today, I'll feel better. Well, nobody ever says I spent the last 3 days in bed by myself and my depression is cured, but your brain lies to you. And so for people to understand that sometimes you have to push yourself, you have to go do those things you don't want to do. And it's the challenges that often help us break out of difficult scenarios and mental health issues.
So I read somewhere where the purpose of a therapist is essentially teach us to retell our own narratives differently, to redirect the voice inside the head. Is that true? Is that what you think?
That's a big part of it. So it's having an objective person who then teaches you, how do you manage that narrator in your head? So when people say have depression, their narrator becomes very sad. It over exaggerates all of the difficulties in life. It really underestimates them. When somebody has anxiety, it will tell you that something terrible is bound to happen. So you really want to learn, how do you manage that narrator in a healthier way? How do you respond to that narrator who tells you these stories? So therapy can be a big part of teaching people to do that, so that when you're done therapy, you're able to do it on your own and you're not dependent on the therapist to reflect that back to you.
Many of my clients today are complaining about kids these days. They're soft, they're weak, they're not able to do the task. React to that for me. Do you feel that there is I hesitate to use the term because it's so condescending, a softness in the mental health of youth today? And well, let's stop there. What do you think? What is your reaction to that?
I do think that kids are struggling more than ever. And I believe that there's been this idea that kids are resilient and that they'll just bounce back. Well, kids aren't born resilient. We need to teach them. And I also buy into the idea that there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma. Grandparents, some of them went through the Depression. The next generation were often Vietnam veterans. The next generation were latchkey kids. And then you get down to today's generation. And I think being raised by somebody who experienced some kind of trauma definitely affects how you were parented. And even though your parents may have had the best of intentions, that can have a trickle-down effect onto today's kids. So while some people say, when it came to COVID, like, oh, these kids are complaining that they have to sit on the couch. Well, your grandfather had to go to war. How could you feel bad about not going to school? But the truth is, I think there is an intergenerational issue sometimes where things get passed down. When you're raised by somebody who has PTSD, or your grandparents had this certain struggle, it's part of it's in your genetics, but also part of it is the way you were raised is slightly different than, say, how another person is raised.
I did read something not long ago that stress, that trauma, and they measured the stress and trauma in, it was concentration camp people who made it through, and there was something unique biologically about their children. Due to the extraordinary trauma of that thing, there was a genetic code in their children that had been passed on. In other words, trauma is truly genetically passed on from one generation to the next, and I was shocked by that. Have you heard that?
I have, and I think it's evolving, and we're learning more about the fact that somebody's genes can absolutely be altered. So there's that genetic component. And then also, if you're raised by somebody who's startled by loud noises, who's struggling with certain things, your parents may have had trouble letting you go out and do amazing things because they had anxiety. Lots of those things are learned as well.
Yeah. The goal of the show, of course, is workplace workforce trends, and we haven't yet even gotten into that. But tell me a little bit about how this mental strength, and we've talked about it somewhat, applies to the workplace. What am I going to see if I'm hiring or trying to find leadership? What are the behaviors, the external behaviors that I'm looking for that will help me find a mentally strong person that will complement my workplace?
Oh, that's a great question. So several things. One would be somebody who can own up to their mistakes. We know it takes a lot of strength to say, hey, I messed up over here. And part of that's creating the environment where it's safe for people to do that, but also somebody who has the mental strength to be able to say, I'm going to risk embarrassing myself by admitting that I did this thing and that wasn't the right thing. Or I'm going to ask a question, even though I might embarrass myself. This may seem obvious to everybody else, but I'm going to take the leap and say, hey, I don't know how to do this. That's key. What
is the nature of the person who says that? I mean, this is a self-confident person. This is a self-aware person. This is a person that doesn't care. What is that? What is the internal thinking machinery of the person that willingly owns up to their mistakes? Is it to avoid embarrassment that we don't do that? What is the machinery behind the person that owns their mistakes?
So it's somebody who is confident. It's somebody who can say, I want to do the very best I can, and I don't really care if somebody judges me. So if you think I'm stupid for asking this question, I can live with that. What I can't live with is not doing my very best. I want to make sure that I have the information and the skills I need to do the best I can.
And is that question, a typical interview question is often, tell me about the biggest mistake you've ever made, or the biggest business mistake you made. Is it designed to reveal that?
That can be a huge part of it. I think we want to know, do people own up to their mistakes, and do they do they paint it in a way that makes them look great in the end? Of course, we know that people will say, oh, my biggest mistake is I didn't take this $1 billion opportunity, but luckily I took the $1 million opportunity that came along the next week. And they turn it into a really glowing representation of themselves. But I think what you really want to look for is somebody who said, I made this mistake and perhaps I didn't own up to it at the time, or when I owned up to it, this is what happened. And it doesn't always need to have a wonderful ending to it. It could be somebody who said, and I learned from that mistake.
Yeah. So it's so owning mistakes is one of them. Give me another one real quick. We're coming up to break. What is a mentally strong person? What does a mentally strong person in the workplace look like?
Somebody that can manage their emotions. We didn't think that feelings had a huge place in the workplace, but they do. So we know that when you're embarrassed, you're more likely to take a huge risk. When you're angry, you're more likely to take a big leap too. When you're anxious, you're likely to say no to something. And you should never negotiate when you're sad, because we're not likely to make a counter offer when somebody makes an offer to us. So there's so many things about our emotions that we want to make sure that we have somebody who can manage their emotions in a healthy way.
Oh man, the workplace used to be a place void of emotion. Now we're saying no. There are emotions. Don't be a fool. Humans don't exist without them. Just learn how to manage them. Amy Morin is with me. She, as I said, she's on the other side of a Zoom call. When we come back for break, Amy, I want to talk about you being an author. You have this expertise in mental strength, but let's talk about the world of an author who is growing and selling lots of books. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. We'll be right back.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence, but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit, with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. Member FINRA, SIPC. Amy Morin wrote an article a while back that got 50 million views, went viral. Her TED Talk video has been viewed more than 22 million times, one of the most popular TED Talks out there. Her subject matter obviously has struck a chord. And the theme of the books, Amy, is 13 things, that unique number, mentally strong people don't do. Mentally strong parents, mentally strong women don't do, mentally strong couples don't do. Let's spend this final segment talking about you as an author. You were a licensed psychotherapist. You told us about the story of how you got into what you got into. And now I would bet you describe yourself as an author and a speaker and a subject matter expert. When did you decide to abandon, or did you decide to abandon the title of counselor and become author? Tell me about that transition.
Oh, great question. So initially I thought, I'm a therapist and I got to write a book. That's cool. And my book came out and I continued to work as a therapist. And I didn't hit any bestsellers lists the week that the book went on sale. And so it was one of those, well, that was a good try. Great. I wrote this book. And about a year and a half after the book came out, I got some unexpected press. Rush Limbaugh talked about my book on his radio show, and the book literally sold out from all of the shelves. And I hit the bestsellers list, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and then the media started calling. And my supervisor at the time, I worked for an agency in rural Maine, and he said, you can probably do this job anytime. You can be a therapist anytime you want, but you should probably go market your book. And I said, yeah, but, these jobs are kind of hard to come by in rural Maine. And so he kindly said, I'm going to put you on the per diem list. And then if you want to come back, the door's open. But if you decide you want to go be an author, just go. And so fortunately kind of gave me that push and the confidence to say, go write more books. And I'm glad that he did.
How did Rush Limbaugh find your book? This seems to me like an unlikely pairing.
Right. Everybody was like, oh, a social worker. And Rush Limbaugh is talking about your work. How did that happen? He had come across the article and so twice, actually, when the article first came out, he talked about it. And then when after the book had come out, he ran through the 13 things on his radio show. And that was all it took to sell the book out everywhere.
Yeah, no kidding. His following, as we both know, was colossal. And lots of people have tried to fill those shoes since and have struggled. But what a fortuitous thing to have had happen for you. So today, the first book was 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. And then how long was the gap between that and the next one, which was 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do?
I think it was probably 3 years between when one hit the shelf and when the parenting book hit the shelf.
And was there an agent in your ear saying, what's the next one? What's the next one? What's the next one?
No. So I had an agent who initially said, that's great that you wrote this book. You might not get another book deal with the same publishing company because, again, the article had 50 million views, but we did not sell 50 million books out of the gate. But then once I said, I'm going to double down on this and start marketing the book full time, things changed and it became clearer that perhaps there was some interest in a second book.
What does a day in the life of a lady who full-time markets a book look like? What does that mean and what is your calendar like?
So it's a lot of writing articles, creating content, and then responding to media requests to be on TV, to do podcast interviews, to weigh in on various articles. And then I launched my own podcast. So I'm doing a lot of podcasting to continue the conversation about mental strength as well.
I want to give you an opportunity to promote that podcast before we go to the next break here. And I've looked on your site and you've interviewed some fairly famous people on this book. How have you gotten in touch with those? You just don't call up Brooke Shields and say, hey, Brooke, my name is Amy. Can I put you on the show?
So strangely enough, Brooke Shields came to us and said, can I be on your podcast? And so
no
we've
kidding.
been in a fortunate position that we've had celebrities who have reached out to us and asked if they could be on the show.
What was her angle? Why did she want to be on it?
So she was promoting something about aging, and she just really wanted to talk about mental strength and aging. And I think, again, the title of the podcast is Mentally Stronger. So we get celebrities who want to tell us what makes them mentally strong.
Do you find that your downloads increase with the celebrities?
Not so much. I think our audience is more interested in knowing somebody that wrote a book, somebody that has expertise. They often want to hear from the experts who've studied this as opposed to maybe a celebrity that they can't relate to as much.
So you live on a sailboat in Marathon Key, Florida. You are literally, let's say, under the water table, underwater at your elevation right now, potentially. I think someone could create an argument that says the lady really isn't connected with the workplace. She's not connected with child rearing trends. She's not. How can she possibly consider she's in the thick of things if she's abandoned her therapy practice, lives on a boat in Florida, and tries to write books on what's going on out there? How do you stay current?
So I would say that's a fair question. But I consult and work with lots of companies, from speaking engagements to companies reaching out, and I do contract work with lots of companies all over the globe. I did spend about, 2.5 years working as the editor-in-chief of Very Well Mind, which is corporate America. Dipped my toe in there. I decided to stop that last May, but spent several years doing that during COVID, especially, and figuring out what does hybrid work look like and remote work in corporate America. So I feel like I dip my toes in enough companies these days that I can still get a pretty good pulse on what they're struggling with and what's going on.
The titling that you do, 13 Things Mentally Strong Blank Don't. It's the antagonizing point of view. Most people would say, here are 13 things mentally strong people do versus don't do. And I recognize the article that you wrote back in 2013 was the beginning of this titling thing, but was there ever an effort to change the way you put things out? You're putting it out in the negative versus the positive. It seems to be working. Tell me why that is working.
I think for me, because again, it started out as a letter to myself on one of the worst days of my life. The last thing I wanted that day was a list of 50 things to do. I was already overwhelmed. So if I said, just don't do these things, you'll be okay. Never intended to write a book or a series of books. But I feel like that's what also resonates with people. Like there's so many things out there bombarding us with all the things we should be doing. But sometimes it's easier to say, just get rid of your worst habit and then your good habits will become much more effective. And it seems more manageable to look at what to give up.
So me walking through the kitchen thinking, don't eat those chips, is better than me walking through the kitchen thinking, all right, you've got to find something tasteless and soulless to eat in order to just continue to fit in your pants. Don't eat the chips versus eat the carrots.
For a lot of people, that works because I think otherwise people are like, well, as long as I eat the carrots today, then I'm doing all right. And they eat the bag of chips and the cookies first and then eat the carrots. Well, they don't equal out. Just don't eat that. And then you don't have to necessarily do all the extra stuff.
That's so true. That's so very true. What's next? What is the next 13 things mentally strong blank? What do you see out there? What's the next need?
So the biggest one I've gotten is about the workplace and business and leadership and that sort of a thing. And I do feel like that would be a cool topic to write about next.
13 things mentally strong managers, leaders, whatever, don't do.
Right.
Yeah. What would be on the list? Hypothesize for me. Give me your table of contents.
So I would say not letting your ego get in the way. We're going to talk about managers and leaders, not letting your ego get in the way, not weaponizing your emotions at work. Yelling and screaming gets what you want, but doesn't make you well liked.
Yeah.
I would say not expecting people to do the things that you won't do yourself. If you're struggling with something, then expecting other people to do it, that's not going to work out so well either.
Do you think in time, with all these management training books that have existed roughly since, I guess, the 1950s, has management and leadership in the workplace gotten better? Or are the challenges that were in place the time the first management book came out in 1950, are those still the same challenges today?
I think a lot of those are the same challenges, and it might even be worse. I think that we're not always promoting the right people. Just because somebody's good at their job doesn't mean that they make a good leader or a good manager. And a lot of people don't have those skills, and we don't necessarily know how to teach those skills to them.
You said promote. Now's the time, Amy. Where do people find more about you?
So my website is the best place. It's Amy Morin, LCSW, as in licensed clinical social worker.com. And there's info about my podcast, Mentally Stronger, and all of my books and my TEDx talk.
Amy, wonderful to reconnect with you again. I'm thrilled for your success. I was captured by the content, and I'm glad to see it's still coming out. Thank you so much. Best wishes to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Back after this break, talking about what we heard, what I learned, and what you can expect upcoming. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Be right back.
I'm Joey Mason. For 4 years, my goal has been to produce the best farm-to-table products I'd ever eaten. I've done just that at our on-site USDA facility in Grand Bay, Alabama, allowing us to ship directly to your door. This is true farm-to-table. Visit us at masonhillsfarm.com to see all that we have to offer.
Well, that was fun. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Again, thank you for staying tuned. What's Working, by the way, is available as a podcast. If you just heard that episode with that conversation, with Amy Morin, and you're thinking, I'd like to hear that again, or more likely, I know someone who needs to hear that, go to whatsworkingcam.com, where you'll find this show as well as every other one we've done. Archived there, you can subscribe, you can listen to it, you can rate the show. Haven't asked for anything like that in a while. So if you could rate the show, and would love it if you do, and put it out there. So you'll find it at whatsworkingcam.com. I thought it was interesting. This whole idea of intergenerational trauma being passed on genetically is fascinating to me. And it makes me wonder, was there any trauma that was passed on genetically to me from my parents to me? We are not born as a blank slate, as we have often thought, as I have often thought. Tabula rasa, ready to be written upon. We inherit the traumas that our parents experienced. It shapes our DNA in some way or another, such that I am born with a mark of that trauma that our parents experienced. So what was the trauma? Was there any trauma that my mother or father may have experienced? We talk about it from a national point of view, from a global point of view, and I used the reference of the Holocaust and the concentration camps. But could it have been something personal that my mother or father faced that was passed on to me, and how is it manifesting on a daily basis? This is all fascinating to me, and it leads obviously to the next question of what it might I be passing on or have passed on to my own children. My oldest is now 21 years old. What happened to me 21 years ago and beyond that may have been passed on to our children? And I love the idea of what not to do. We talked about that as well. Her point being that we can walk through the kitchen and say, all I need to do is eat the carrots and I'll be healthy. So I eat the carrots and the cookies and the chips. Versus if we oppose it and say, don't eat the chips, we're more likely to get to our goals more quickly. So her titling convention, as I referenced it, seems to make sense to me. I guess the question each of us needs to ask every day is, what are the things that I should be doing? It's hard not to go down that path. But perhaps more importantly, what are the things I should not be doing? I shouldn't be listening to myself. I shouldn't be curled up in a ball, fearful. What are the things that we shouldn't be doing? And I'm finally, it's nice to hear the point of view of a lady whose business is largely self-promotion and selling those books in her speeches, because I am in that camp too. Self-promotion. Let me tell you about my radio show. Let me tell you about the speeches that I give. Let me tell you about the books that I've written, etc. It gets a little self-conscious every now and then. However, it's the business that I'm in. And if I didn't feel like the content that I offer, if Amy didn't feel like the content that she offers had value, perhaps we'd be a little bit sheepish about it, but we're not. Go to what'sworkingcam.com, speaking of which, to find the show. You can also sign up there to get a free copy of the book, What Works, the 10 Best Ideas from the first 200 episodes. And I hope you will. It's a collection of the best ideas, not best episodes, but the best ideas that have been shared with us, and we'll hope you'll find it and find that book helpful. All right, sign up. You'll get more information from us as time goes along about what we got going on, and always new things planned. Grateful for your time and attention. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Have a good week, everybody. As you likely know, this show originates as a radio show broadcast across the state of Alabama, and it continues to grow in both radio listeners and market. After it's formatted for radio, we then turn it into this podcast. Please share it with those you think would find it interesting, and subscribe to the podcast on my YouTube page, where you can leave messages and your thoughts and your comments, and I'll certainly get back in touch. Finally, if you're a fan of the show, please offer a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can find my book called What Works on Amazon.com. In it, I highlight the top 10 ideas from the first 200 episodes of the show. Mind you, they're not the top 10 best episodes, they're the top 10 best ideas. Many times the same ideas are brought up again and again by different guests, and we dig into those ideas in such a way that they'll be easily applicable for your business. Simply go to Amazon and enter my name, and you'll find What Works as well as my other books. Chapter titles include How to Find a Niche, Innovation, Building Teams, and so forth. To learn more about the workshops and seminars I offer, go to cammarston.com. There you can view clips of my work, view workshop titles, view my reviews, case studies, customer lists. It's all there. If you'd like a free copy of one of the chapters of my book, enter your email address at the bottom of the homepage at cammarston.com. And from that site, you can email me directly. I always love to hear from you. You'll also find me on social media. Find Cam Marston on all the social media platforms, and you may need to enter the numeral 1. There's one other Cam Marston out there, and that numeral 1 distinguishes me from him from time to time. So if you're unsure if it's me or not, enter that numeral 1 after my name, and it should do the trick. On a more personal and less professional side, I record weekly commentaries that air across Alabama on Alabama Public Radio twice each day on Fridays, called Keeping It Real. They've won statewide and national awards. They're simple observations on the world as it goes on around me, and they're only a few minutes long. They're a passion. You can find them on the same podcast app you're using to listen to this. Finally, if you're interested in advertising on this podcast or the radio show, reach out. I've worked hard to cultivate a specific listener, and I can tell you all about them, and I have many different options for helping you reach them. Thanks again for listening. We'll have another episode available soon.